Keep in mind that last summer, Speaker Pelosi and other Democrats refused to denounce the defund police movement. The times seem to have changed. Some even supported that movement. Are Democrats coming to a point where they just can't ignore the bad results that have emerged from policing policies they're pushing to support? Here with me now to talk about this and more is U.S. Representative Andy Biggs, who serves as chairman of the House Freedom Caucus and represents the 5th Congressional District of Arizona. Congressman Biggs, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Joseph. Good to be with you.
Well, first of all, what are your thoughts on the rise in crime that we're seeing across the nation?
Well, the one thing that Nancy Pelosi got right is it definitely is outrageous and it's dangerous. The one thing that you count on your government to do more than anything else is to protect you from criminals and bad guys and bullies. Doesn't mean nothing will ever bad will happen, but when you have great police forces enforcing the law, it mitigates against bad things happening. And so it's not a surprise that we see this going, we see high crime rates wherever the Democrats have controlled and said, look, we want to defund police and we want to get rid of prisons and any kind of punishment whatsoever. That's where they are, and this is what happens in those locations, in those cities, in those neighborhoods, in those communities.
You saw Speaker Pelosi's comments there. She said there's an attitude of lawlessness in our country that springs from, well, I don't know where. Do you have a thought about that? Where is this coming from? It is troubling. What's the source of this?
Well, I think she was trying to imply something that somehow Trump supporters invoke lawlessness, but the reality is it is from the left that has encouraged Antifa and BLM. And when you allow rioting to go on, and it wasn't just allowing rioting, I mean, they removed police from a precinct in Minneapolis so that rioters could actually destroy and vandalize that. You've had directives from city councils to say, let people with small crimes, let them out. We're not going to enforce the law. You've had Secretary Mayorkas tell Immigration and Customs Enforcement, don't enforce the law. You have 1 million people wandering around here with removal orders from the country, and you have your Homeland Secretary saying, we're not going to go after you. We're not going to remove you. This type of lawlessness that we're seeing on the rise comes from a disrespect for the law. It comes from this notion that these people have of we aren't governed by the rule of law. We're not controlled by the rule of law. And it's going to, I'm afraid, Joseph, it's going to perpetuate because they're talking a game now, but they're not really doing anything to change the situation that they've created.
I think you have touched on something significant there, this sense of lawlessness and a real disrespect for the law that I think has been a long time in coming. The question, of course, is how do you address that? How do you solve it? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, first of all, you need your police to be able to, first of all, you have to give them the equipment and the force size that they need. You can't keep taking away money and resources from them. So that's number one. Number two, you allow them to make arrests in accordance with the law, and you allow process to work, due process to work. That means that the prosecutors can't be letting out people who are charged with crimes to come out the next day. So they get arrested on Tuesday night, they're going to let them out Wednesday morning. You have to, prosecutors have to keep people in custody and prosecute the crimes and try the cases. And let's, if you do that, you will restore respect for law. It's a deterrent effect. Right now, there's no general deterrence in our society and no specific deterrence in our society. And without those two things, you cannot have the rule of law. The other thing, of course, Joseph, is our educational institutions have to be taken back over by people who respect the history of this country, and they respect the law and the rights that we recognize that God has given to each of us.
Yeah. I think you're right that law enforcement needs to be supported and given the authority to do this. I may be equally as concerned, though, by the number of people who are apparently willing to commit crime with impunity, that there's not any social pressure. There's not this sense of self-respect that that's not something I do. And the number of people who seem willing to just steal because they don't think they're going to get in trouble, that is just as troubling to me as the lack of law enforcement there to stop them from doing it. But Jen Psaki was asked about this lawlessness conversation in Washington, D.C. And she suggested that a lot of this had to do with COVID and the pandemic. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, that's just ludicrous. That's providing an excuse. The reality is we've lost our moral compass. We've created a vacuum of secularity in this country. And by doing that, people don't feel that they're going to be held accountable in this life because we don't enforce the rule of law, nor in the next life because they're being taught that there is no next life. And as long as you have those two disconnects there, it's going to be real hard to bring this back. But it has nothing to do with COVID. What this has to do is people afraid of enforcing the law. I mean, so right now, Joseph, if you go to San Francisco, pictures we've seen out of San Francisco today, you've got people who don't want their cars vandalized. So they're opening the doors and the trunks so people can come in and see whether there's anything worth stealing. So when you tell people you can go to the drugstore, CVS or whatever, and say, as long as you don't steal more than $1,000, we're not going to stop you. That's a morality problem. That is a secularity problem. And that's where I think the vacuum that's been created here has produced this horrible situation that we're seeing.
I think that's exactly right. And the mayor of San Francisco, in her comments about refunding the police after defunding them last week, she said anecdotally that 90 to 95% of the people in San Francisco in that room had been personally victims of some kind of property crime, which is an absurd thing to say. And of course, I have no support for that, but that was just the way she described the nature of this problem. So it is bad, but I think there might be some encouragement from the fact that on the left, their tone is changing, and maybe we're going to be able to come together to address this. But this is not the only issue on which the tone is changing. There's been another change, of course, for the Democrats in Washington, D.C., and I'm referring to Build Back Better or Build Government Bigger, depending on how you prefer Biden's legislative priority. Chuck Schumer has announced that they are moving away from that, and now they're going to focus on the Voting Rights Act in the Senate instead. What do you make of that?
Well, they weren't going to get their votes. So the Build a Bigger Bankruptcy bill is basically on hiatus, maybe permanently dead. But a huge, dangerous bill is H.R. 1 and H.R. 4. Those two bills, they're dealing with this voting, the federalization of voting. And H.R. 1 is the most egregious, although H.R. 4 has got massive problems too. But H.R. 1 basically is going to codify all of the election irregularities that you've seen. They're going to codify those and regularize those so that you will see more of that. And we need just the opposite. We need to have, just like on the smash and grabs and the violence crimes that are increasing, we need to make sure that we stop this assault on election integrity. Let's bring transparency back in. Let's bring accountability back in. And H.R. 1, which is the bill that Schumer's talking about, is particularly dangerous because it basically ignores the constitutional obligation of states to set and conduct these elections. And the last thing you and I want or should want is for the feds to have even more power over elections.
I think a lot of people agree with you on that. Now, yesterday, Chuck Schumer, Senator Schumer, he had these comments to say on the Senate floor about this change in priority. I want to play those and then give you a chance to respond.
There is universal view in our caucus that we need to pass legislation to protect our democracy. What the Republican legislatures are doing on a purely partisan basis is undermining, destroying our democracy.
What's he referring to there that the Republicans are doing that is undermining and destroying our democracy?
Well, one thing that they think is just so onerous is to require identification when you go to vote. And the bill that he wants would take away any opportunity to have that as a directive. And the problem for him is that 80% of the country, whether you're Democrat, Independent, or Republican, regardless of your racial heritage, you support identification in elections. We all know it's really simple. So that's what he's talking about. They want permanent universal mail-in ballots, and that is another way to have fraud in an election. And so he is talking about this notion that we want to have a fair, transparent a series of elections. and they want something very different. They want to control the election from the federal government, and they want to control it in a way that, dead people in Chicago can still keep voting, I guess. But that's really what we're talking about, Joseph, is the distinction between Senator Schumer's desire to push forward on on HR 1. He's saying that, by the way, they project this. So they say that we're trying to stop free and fair elections. That's what they're trying to do with HR 1. We really want to make them fair and transparent. And so we're not proposing massive changes. We're proposing common sense changes that have worked.
In about 15 seconds, are they going to have better luck with the Voting Rights Act than they did with Build Back Better?
Not unless they can get around the filibuster.
And it remains to be seen. Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema do not seem keen to do that. Representative Biggs, thank you so much for your time being with us again today.
Thanks, Joseph. Good to be with you. Have a Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you as well. And it is interesting.